each other. Turks didn't want us, the Greeks didn't want us. I finally flew to Italy, and then I was put in charge of 550 sailors who were reporting to all the ships off Cyprus and making sure they all got to the right ships. Then they let me off, and helicopter came. I was flown to the deck of the carrier, and that began my tour. And Father Frank was with me. Father Frank Mitchell just happened to be also from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Big thing in the newspapers. We had Packer jerseys, sweatsuits, whole thing. We were adopted by the community. So it was a beautiful 2 years. The second year, we were in that, the first year, Father and I said, well, we're out here. Let's make sure we do the journeys of Paul in our Sunday services. And so we did them. Look at that island over there. That's Crete. What happened with Paul in the island of Crete? Each of these little stepping stones, all the way from the Middle East, all the way across to Italy and Greece. Wonderful things. And the crew really enjoyed it. In fact, I still get emails from some of the sailors that remembered, as we stood on the flight deck, following the journeys of Paul 2,000 years almost later. Beautiful things. But the second year, an event happened aboard our ship. And that thing that happened was that one of the shafts torqued, twisted, like a corkscrew. Those shafts are that big around. One of the four main shafts twisted like a corkscrew. We had to lock that propeller, which meant the carrier could only go 12 knots, dragging a locked propeller. You need 24 knots of wind off the flight deck to launch an airplane. You getting technical now? 24 knots of wind. If you can't go 24 knots and there's no wind, what happens to your airplanes? They sit on the deck. We had to solve the problem. It looked like we might have to get another carrier out there and end our cruise, but it was finally determined by some engineers back in Norfolk, Virginia, that they could fly the pieces out to us and we could get repairs so long as we could get into a harbor where the ship didn't move. Because this huge thing has to be within 1/1000th of an inch in alignment. World War II. We got to Taranto, we put in that beautiful harbor, and the captain called Father Frank, up to his office and said, "Chaplains, I don't think we can have liberty here, but we're going to be here for 2 weeks." Mayor and Father Frank said yes, and the presiding bishop. And captain said, "Yeah, that's a good idea too, I guess." Okay. Make peace with them, find out, can we get a park or something so that we can bus our crew in and they can play games, have parties, each drink 1 can of beer, and then they would take it back to the ship and let another group go. And chaplain's here in charge of it. Yes, sir. Okay, here we go. Wonderful visit with the mayor. It was short, it was brief, but he welcomed us, was happy to see us there. And when we told him, no, we're not going to have the sailors wandering all your streets, because I don't think you could handle that, and we can't. Then we went to the great cathedral and sat in the office with the Cardinal Bishop. And of course, Father Frank bowed and welcomed him, and he realized Father Frank, of course, was a Catholic one. I was a Protestant one, though our uniforms looked the same. But there we were. There's coming up in a minute. We're not there yet. That's not the cathedral. I asked the bishop about the history of that ancient cathedral and so on. And he smiled and said, come on. Here we were in this great cathedral, and he said, come on. So we went down the stairs. We remember this because Father did by one of the cardinals in Rome to underneath the basilica to the St. Peter. That is now closed because of dangers of destruction. He led us down to the basement, digging underneath the foundations of the church like archaeologists dig brushes, things. The bishop said, come, look. We went there and looked now. They were uncovering the most beautiful mosaic I had ever seen. And that mosaic was the size of the cathedral, which had been built. Turns out, as I studied history later, that by the middle 1950s, so World War II and all the things that had happened said, we ancient route called the Appian Way. Okay? The road that went from Taranto to Rome with Bran covering the cathedral had been, without knowledge probably, built over the place where Paul and Peter landed and began their journey to Rome. And he said, Quinn, hold out your hand. And he placed in my hands, I looked at it, it was a little silver cross, no bigger than this, is a silver cross. And he said, what you're holding is a cross that Paul brought from Ephesus to Rome and gave to one of the believers here, the church, ever since. I didn't think much more of it, but when my tour with the Forum did, I was assigned to as an assistant wing chaplain at Cherry Point, North Carolina, to a Marine Air Wing. Cherry Point, North Carolina, swampiest place you've ever been. Mosquitoes. But my second year there, I had a deployment to joint exercise, to do a joint exercise with the Turkish Air Force. And so an eventful trip that has a story all of its own, but we finally 180 Marines, and then the aviators and our Marine airplanes, and ready to do it. But we were going to be there for 6 weeks, and we realized we could not have just free liberty again. Not only but there's aware of the customs of this country, but there's a lot of friction, and we don't need any problems. Chaplain, here we go again. Find some things for the Marines to do. Well, my Turkish interpreter said, I know a tour agency. They're not expensive. Let's get them here. So we started tours. Loaded up 2, 3, 4 buses. And I combined those tours with the Sunday services. And I was having to do both Catholic and Protestant. But in the sermon, talking about these places. We went to the amphitheater in Smyrna. Now, many, if you haven't read biblical history, Polycarp was bishop of Smyrna during the second great oppression of Christians. And they were Christians by Rome. And they were given the choice to either and pledge allegiance to the emperor and the gods of Rome, or to die at the stake. And this is recorded in history. I have served Christ for 80 plus years. Now, that's pretty old in those days. Pretty darn old. How many are over 80 now, besides me? Bunch of us, yeah. Oh, but here he was, really an old man for his time. He said, I will not recant. And Polycarp was what was left, and Polycarp was martyred at the stake, but never forgotten. Amphitheater, what was left of it, but very visible. And then we went to the house where Mary and John, and the cemetery next to it were John and baby Mary. The Catholic Church disputes that because in their theology, Mary had to ascend rather than die. But nonetheless, the two graves are there and marked. And then Ephesus. And when you got there, it had not changed much from 2000. And you walked that path, and some of the buildings still common in that area. And I went down that path, and one of our which is coming up in a year or two. No, I don't mean to pick on you. Look at that. That's the way it looks, and that's the main path walking down. One of the 5 buildings, library. They're pretty sure it was, the library. And the amphitheater in the distance. In the amphitheater is seated over 2,000 people. No sound system. Turn off your light. All go to the very top of this amphitheater, which is higher than the top of our church building. And up and up. Interestingly, there were tunnels dug out of that amphitheater that went through the stone of the hill, out of and climb up to walk that past seats. We stood as the gentleman spoke to us in a very soft voice, word, because behind him was a stone facade, maybe 20 feet wide, curved, maybe 10. What a sound system. We don't need a Tom. We can turn it all on. What a wonderful. But the history he was telling me was what I really centered on today. That street that we walked, like this, that street was filled with the silversmiths and tradesmen and people that were homeless. Only 9% of the population of that part of the world at that time had what we would call today a dwelling. For what it must have been in that day. Well, what did Paul do as a trade? Anybody tell me? He was troops. Rude shelters made out of animal skins. And that's where they lived. If you visit Rome, you look at the hills. The names escape my feeble brain at the moment. But you look at the hills in Rome. What's in those hills? Hills in the center of Rome. And what's in those hills? Nothing but caves. And what were those caves? Homes, where the people lived, the homeless. And so that beautiful message that Paul gives is that here are the people of the Spirit. Of course, Paul raised a ruckus, didn't he? When I was at the top of that arena, I could look out, and in the valley, distant, one huge pillar, massive pillar, stood straight and tall. One. I found out that was one of the 13 pillars that made up the Temple of Artemis. Artemis. Anybody know who Artemis was? Male or female? No. Hey, they were very different in that time and day in their religions. She was a female goddess, Artemis. And that temple was 7 times the size of the Parthenon in Greece. 7 times the size. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, this beautiful temple. And they worshipped Artemis. Great is the goddess Artemis, great to be praised. She is the goddess of the hunter, the bow and arrow, and the goddess of craftsmen. How did that temple come to be? 1,000 years before that, a great golden statue fell from the sky. And they started building. And by 200 years before Christ, this massive thing stood. Time of Paul, it was still there, but then an earthquake later. They didn't have much concrete in those days. They just piled heavy stone on heavy stone, and what happens in an earthquake? Look out. One pillar left. The other pillars had followed. There's one in the British Museum. There's one in the museum in Egypt. They're taken away. What happened to all the stones? I saw a field of stones there, and I said, stones, excuse me. The stones the size of the doorway to the sanctuary, each one of them. Beautiful writing on them. Why don't they put a building together? And the guy said, come here and take a look. So I looked, wow. There's stuff on this side too. Oh my God, there's stuff back here too. He said, yes. He said, because the custom was when the earthquakes came and the buildings fell, what did they do? They grabbed the stones, turned whatever was on them around, made a new building,